Elliot Monroe had always lived with dirt beneath his nails. 40 years as a field ecologist gave him a deeper love for nature than any HOA landscaping committee ever would. After retiring from his government job, he purchased the modest ranch-style house at the edge of Silver Glen Estates, drawn by its privacy, silence, and most of all, the soil. He'd tested that soil before buying. Rich in nutrients, perfect acidity, deep water table. It was a gardener's dream. Over 5 years, he transformed the front yard into a miniature arboretum. The centerpiece, 7 rare Japanese maples, each one cultivated from saplings he'd collected during a research trip to Kyoto. He gave them names: Aiko, Renji, Hana. They weren't just plants. They were memory, legacy, peace. Then came the yellow, slip, taped to his door like a parking ticket. It stood out against the dark wood grain like a warning shot. A violation notice from the Silver Glen HOA, citing unauthorized non-standard vegetation, exceeding front yard visibility parameters. He stared at it, then reread it 3 times. Visibility parameters, he muttered aloud, incredulous. He walked to the street and crouched. Sure, the maples stood tall, maybe 6, 7 feet, but they were spaced perfectly, maintained meticulously. They didn't obstruct views, and certainly didn't pose a safety issue. He thought it had to be a mistake. The next day, he marched down to the HOA office, a sterile room tucked behind the clubhouse, and asked to speak with someone in charge. That's when he met Marlene Crick. Marlene was the kind of person who ironed her socks and found joy in pointing out chipped paint on neighbors' porch railings. Her hair was sprayed into a helmet, and her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "I assume you're here about the trees," she said. Before he even sat down. "They've been there for years," Elliot said, carefully measured. "They're not harming anyone. I've even registered them with the County Heritage Flora program. They don't match the HOA's approved landscaping list," Marlene said flatly, tapping a plastic binder as if it were a holy text. "Your maples aren't native. They're not on the list. You've been given 14 days to remove them. You want me to rip out living trees because they're not on a list from 2003. Correct." Elliot didn't yell, didn't argue. He just stood, quietly, with a look that said everything. That night, he filed a formal appeal and sent it, certified mail. Attached were soil reports, plant registration, and 3 letters from landscape architects, verifying the trees were of no hazard. Days passed, no reply. Then came the weekend. Elliot took a trip to visit his sister out of state. When he returned Sunday evening, he turned the corner into his street and froze. A pile of branches sat on his lawn like a corpse. His heart slammed in his chest. He rushed out of the car, stumbling over his feet as he sprinted to the wreckage. Sawdust was everywhere. The trunks, his trees, were gone. Clean cuts, fresh wounds in the earth. A white laminated sign had been staked into the ground. Work performed in accordance with HOA Ruling 47B. Violation cleared. Elliot stood in silence for a full minute. His hands trembled, not with grief, with something colder, more calculated. He picked up one of the fallen leaves and studied it. Red, veined, fragile. Then he turned to look at the other houses on the street. They were all the same. Beige, trimmed, sterile. He whispered, "You think this is your street." Then he said it again, louder. "No. You've just been renting it from the wrong man." And in that moment, something in Elliot Monroe, lover of trees, gentle cultivator, snapped, and something much colder, much more patient, began to grow. The sound didn't register at first. Elliot thought it was a neighbor mowing their lawn, but it was too early. Just after 6 in the morning, and too harsh. This wasn't the lazy hum of a mower. It was sharp, guttural, predatory. A chainsaw. He jolted upright in bed, heartbeat hammering against his ribs. His eyes darted to the window. Then he saw it. Men in reflective vests, hard hats, one dragging limbs, another revving a saw. No, Elliot didn't bother with shoes. He grabbed his robe and tore through the front door, feet hitting dewy grass. Stop! What the hell are you doing? The foreman, a stout man with a clipboard and zero expression, didn't even blink. He pointed to a laminated document taped to a wooden stake in the yard. Work order, HOA authorization, section 47B, removal of non-compliant vegetation. Behind him, a worker fired up another chainsaw. The roar drowned Elliot's next words, though he screamed them anyway. One of the maples, Hannah, was already gone. Nothing but a severed stump, oozing sap like blood. Get off my property! Elliot shouted, voice cracking with fury. But the men were like machines, efficient, detached, hired to do a job, not ask questions. They ignored him completely. Then came the white SUV. Marlene Crick stepped out in a pressed linen suit, sipping from a metal tumbler. "Good morning, Mr. Monroe," she said, all saccharine cheer. "You're up early, just in time to witness. Compliance in action. You did this," he hissed. "You had my trees destroyed, without notice. While I was out of town, we posted the ruling, gave you 2 weeks. You were in violation. The board voted unanimously. I filed an appeal. We reviewed it." She smiled. "And denied it. The bylaws are clear." A second tree cracked, falling onto the grass with a dull, sick thud. Elliot flinched. Marlene didn't. "They were rare," he said, barely breathing. "Protected species, registered with the county." "Oh, Elliot," Marlene cooed, patting his arm with condescension. "You should have planted hydrangeas like everyone else." Elliot stared at her hand, like it was something rotten. He turned away, walked back toward the house, slowly, deliberately. She laughed. "Not going to fight it anymore." "No," he said softly. "Just going to let the roots dry." Inside, Elliot stood in his study. For a moment, he didn't move. His fingers trembled, not with helplessness, but with calculation. He opened the bottom drawer of a locked file cabinet, pulled out a thin black folder labeled Phase 1, Acquisition. He flipped it open. Names, addresses, mortgage statuses, a map of the neighborhood, marked in red and green. He hadn't touched this in years. It was a thought experiment, really. A hypothetical, a legacy plan. Now it was war. That evening, Elliot didn't sleep. He sat in the dark with a cup of black coffee and a memory of sap on his hands. He thought about how they'd mocked him, how they'd erased years of care with a 40-minute chainsaw job and a plastic sign. But chainsaws were loud, brutal, inelegant. Elliot believed in quiet destruction, the kind you didn't notice until it was too late, and in the silence of his once proud garden, he whispered something to himself, not a promise, but a verdict. "You took my trees. I'll take your neighborhood." It began with a cup of coffee and a casual conversation. Elliot didn't dress like a threat. Khaki jacket, wireframe glasses, the faint smell of mulch on his sleeves. To the outside world, he looked like a kindly retiree, with too much time and not enough grandkids. But that morning, he sat across from Lance Berman, regional loan officer at First State Bank, and laid out the framework of a plan that would eventually topple a suburban empire. "I'm starting a holding company," Elliot said, sliding a slim manila folder across the table. Real estate only, residential, within a very specific region. Behrman, young and greedy, barely hid his enthusiasm as he flipped through the documents. You want to invest in a neighborhood. I want to own it, Elliot replied, sipping his coffee. The banker chuckled, thinking it was a joke, but Elliot's face didn't move. Over the next hour, Elliot outlined a shell company, Redwood Holdings, LLC, structured to purchase residential homes discreetly. The paperwork was airtight. The strategy was simple. Buy homes at market value, or just above. Offer generous cash deals to restless owners, and never mention the real motive. Why Silver Glen? Behrman asked, frowning. HOA-controlled communities tend to be stable. Investments. Not a lot of turnover. Elliot gave a quiet smile. That's the appeal. Stability breeds complacency. Complacency leads to neglect. He didn't explain further. By the end of the week, Redwood Holdings was born, registered under a Delaware address with a P.O. box and a figurehead CEO. No paper trail led directly to Elliot, just the way he wanted. The first house came easily. Lotted. 12. Beige two-story with a cracked driveway and a tired couple nearing retirement. Elliot sent a man in a suit, a friend from his poker nights, to make the offer. No pressure. Full cash. 30-day close. No inspection required. The couple had been fighting with the HOA for years. Over a fence 2 inches too tall, they signed. The papers the next morning. Within 2 months, Elliot had acquired 5 more homes, scattered across the neighborhood, like puzzle pieces waiting to be connected. Some through Redwood, others through secondary shells. Acer Investments, Maple Line Properties, all with unique tax IDs, all leading nowhere visible. No one noticed, not even Marlene. She was too busy issuing citations for unsanctioned mailbox. Paint and improper garden gnomes. Elliot attended HOA meetings now, not to speak, to watch, to listen. He sat in the back, unremarkable in his beige sweater, nodding politely as Marlene rattled off enforcement updates. But beneath the calm exterior, he was cataloguing weaknesses. Board divisions, owner complaints, proxy rules, voting thresholds. The board treasurer, a nervous man named Stuart Weldon, was his first target. Elliot invited him for lunch under the guise of discussing Stuart's late brother's rare orchid collection. Over sandwiches and wine, Elliot casually mentioned a real estate trust with Stuart's name on it. An unfortunate coincidence that tied back to improper fund withdrawals from HOA reserves 2 years ago. You've been sloppy, Stuart, Elliot said gently, sliding a flash drive across the table. But don't worry, I'm not here to expose you. What do you want? Your house, Elliot said, and your vote. Within days, Stuart resigned, due to health reasons. Elliot, through his Redwood proxy, appointed a replacement, a soft-spoken single mother who hated the HOA more than she hated morning traffic. It was starting. The vines were creeping through the cracks. No one saw Elliot Monroe as the architect of this silent war. But like roots beneath concrete, he was already everywhere. It started as a whisper. Then it became a ripple. By the time Marlene noticed, it was a wave. In the early spring, the board meetings became less predictable. Residents who had never spoken before now voiced coordinated complaints about the broken sprinklers in the communal park, about the $15 monthly beautification fee that hadn't beautified anything, about how the board treasurer had quietly resigned without explanation and hadn't been replaced through a vote. Marlene Crick prided herself on control, but something was shifting. and she felt it in her bones. The tightness in her jaw returned. Her husband noticed her muttering numbers in her sleep. At the April board meeting, a man named Brian Kinsey stood up and demanded to see the HOA's last 3 years of financials. Per the bylaws, he said, tapping a printed copy. They're supposed to be publicly available upon written request. I submitted mine 2 weeks ago, Marlene bristled. They're being reviewed by our accountant. Which one? He asked. She couldn't answer. There was no accountant. Stuart Weldon had handled the books personally until he vanished. She moved on quickly, too quickly, and Elliot, sitting in the third row in his usual beige sweater, made a small note in the margin of his notebook. After the meeting, Marlene demanded a complete homeowner list from the HOA secretary. When the file arrived, she scanned it with growing dread. Redwood Holdings LC owned 17 homes. 17. There were only 61 in the entire development. She pulled up the neighborhood map and started highlighting parcels. They weren't grouped together, they were scattered, strategically, like chess pieces, at corners, near intersections, around the clubhouse, enough to control the direction of any neighborhood vote with carefully placed proxies. She dug deeper. Maple Line Properties, Acer Investments, 7 homes under different names. But the paperwork led to similar email domains. Same mailing address in Delaware. No public contacts. No names. The walls were closing in, and she didn't even know who was building them. By May, the board was fracturing. Linda, the vice president, missed 2 meetings in a row and stopped returning Marlene's calls. She claimed she had family matters, but Marlene spotted her having coffee with that new woman, the one who'd replaced Stuart. They were laughing. A motion appeared on the June agenda. Review of bylaws. Proposal to re-evaluate. Section 47B. Marlene's hands trembled as she read it. Section 47B. The same bylaw that gave her the authority to destroy Elliot's trees. Someone was unraveling her legacy, clause by clause. The HOA president called an emergency executive session. Only board members. No residents, but Elliot had already anticipated it. That same night, anonymous letters appeared in 5 mailboxes. Copies of emails, financial inconsistencies, invoices paid to a landscaping company that didn't exist 6 months ago. A blurry photo of Marlene's BMW parked outside the contractor's office. The next morning, the rumors bloomed. By July, 4 homes had bright yellow banners on the porch railings that read, HOA Free the Trees. Technically, it violated HOA rules, but Marlene had stopped enforcing fines. She couldn't afford to. Every time she pushed, something pushed back. And behind every letter, every banner, every whisper, Elliot Monroe sat in his garden, tending to soil and sipping iced tea, watching, as the house she built began to crack under its own weight. And still, she didn't know it was him. Not yet. The summer ballot wasn't supposed to matter. Every year, the HOA mailed out the same vanilla vote. Board renewals, budget line items, maybe a landscaping vendor change if someone complained about the grass height again. Most residents tossed it in the trash or left it unopened. But this year was different. The first sign came in the envelope, sleek black paper instead of the usual white. The ballot header read, in clean serif font, Proposal 9B, motion to dissolve the current HOA Board of Directors and install interim governance pending resident vote. Attached was a full-page summary of grievances. Misappropriation of funds, unilateral rule enforcement, illegal removal of private property, and one accusation of destruction of heritage flora under false authority. Each bullet point was footnoted with receipts, photos, and contact information for corroborating parties. It was surgical. No name was listed as the author, no direct signature, but it bore the unmistakable mark of precision. Elliot's mark. The neighborhood erupted. Some residents were outraged, not at the proposal, but at what it revealed. Others were furious it had taken this long. A few, mostly the old guard loyal to Marlene, suspected foul play, but even they knew something had shifted. The proposal felt final. Marlene was apoplectic. She stormed into the clubhouse that morning in full war regalia, shoulder pads, pearls, a thick binder of rules that had guided her reign for 15 years. She slammed it on the table in front of Linda, who hadn't looked her in the eye in weeks. "This is a coup," Marlene hissed. "An illegal, fraudulent attempt to dismantle the governing authority of this neighborhood." Linda didn't flinch. "The signatures are valid. The proposal meets the 2/3 proxy requirement. The residents have a right to vote." "I am the residents," Marlene shouted. "This board is what holds this place together." "No," came a voice from behind them. "It holds it down." Marlene turned, and for the first time, Elliot Monroe stood at the front of the room. Not in beige, not in his gardening gloves, but in a pressed navy jacket and polished shoes. Calm, poised, she blinked. I tried peace," Elliot said. "I tried reason. But you cut down my trees while I was grieving my brother. Without warning, without legal standing. You didn't just kill plants, Marlene. You declared war." Marlene's voice cracked with disbelief. "You think you can run this place?" "I don't want to run it," Elliot said. "I want to end what it's become." He turned to the residents now gathered in the clubhouse lobby, ballots in hand, eyes wide. "You deserve a neighborhood, not a dictatorship." A silence fell. A heavy, pregnant pause. Then Brian Kinsey stood and raised his hand. "I vote yes." Another followed, then another. It spread like fire. The vote was held that evening. When the final count was tallied, the numbers weren't close. 41 in favor, 15 against. Marlene's hands trembled as the board president read the result aloud. Her empire, dismantled by ballot, not with violence, but with quiet precision. She stood, rage, disbelief, and humiliation competing on her face. "This isn't over," she whispered to Elliot. "No," he said. "It's just beginning." Outside, a soft breeze rustled the saplings Elliot had planted in the backyard. Replacement trees, yes, but also something more. Something symbolic. Something rooted. The neighborhood didn't know it yet, but the man they had ignored, dismissed, and underestimated had just taken control. Not through force, through patience. The old board dissolved like mist at dawn. Marlene Crick vanished from the neighborhood as quietly as her influence had spread. No farewell parties, no angry confrontations. Just silence, and the lingering scent of crushed magnolia blossoms in the air. With the vote finalized, Elliot Monroe stepped into an uncertain role, caretaker of a community, tangled in years of neglect, suspicion, and quietly boiling resentment. But there was a catch. The bylaws, so rigid under Marlene's iron fist, had no protocol for a dissolved board without an immediate replacement. In the legal void, Silver Glen was effectively leaderless. No one to approve budgets, enforce rules, or maintain common areas. In theory, it was anarchy. Word spread fast. The clubhouse doors, once tightly shut, were now unlocked, inviting residents in, but no one sure who was in charge. Trash bins overflowed, sprinklers sputtered and died. Mowed lawns turned to weeds. The communal pool became a stagnant pond. Some neighbors embraced the freedom. Late-night barbecues echoed through backyards. Kids took over the playground, unsupervised and wild. Paint colors brightened, fences crept higher, and mailbox decorations multiplied without restriction. Others panicked. Utility bills went unpaid. Suspicious cars prowled the streets at odd hours. Marlene's loyalists whispered that Elliot's quiet takeover was a facade masking a deeper, darker plan. Elliot observed it all, not from the clubhouse, but from his front porch, shaded by new saplings growing steadily taller. He never claimed to want power, but he did want change. The first order of business: stabilize the chaos. He enlisted Linda, the single mother who had replaced Stuart Weldon, now chairing a provisional neighborhood committee. Together, they drafted new guidelines. Less about control, more about community. No heavy-handed rules, just a simple agreement on shared responsibilities. A framework to rebuild trust, but the real work was below the surface. Elliot reached out quietly to residents whose homes he owned. Invitations arrived. Neighborhood renewal meeting, promising refreshments, ideas, and a vision. Attendance was low but deliberate. A mix of long-time owners, renters, tired of HOA meddling, and the wary. He listened more than he spoke. And then, slowly, he planted ideas. What if Silver Glen weren't about restriction, but resilience? What if residents were empowered, not policed? What if this neighborhood was a sanctuary, not just for humans, but for nature, history, and community? Whispers turned to conversations. Neighbors began organizing small projects, community gardens, free tool libraries, block parties. Slowly, the air shifted. The weeds didn't vanish overnight, but so did the tension. Yet, even as this new vision took root, Elliot's true plan unfolded. Ownership meant leverage. Votes on issues, zoning changes, enforcement policies. All in his hands, controlled by his shell companies. Quietly, meticulously, and in the shadows, Marlene's loyalists weren't idle. They plotted in whispers, seeking allies beyond Silver Glen, lobbying county officials, threatening legal battles. They called Elliot a usurper, a menace to community, order. But Elliot welcomed the challenge. Every rumor, every attempt to undermine him only tightened the community bonds he was forging. He was patient, like the roots beneath his destroyed trees, growing strong where no one looked. One evening, standing under the glow of street lamps, Elliot watched a group of kids chase fireflies through his reclaimed yard. He smiled to himself. Silver Glen was no longer Marlene's, it was his. But this was only the beginning. The neighborhood was changing, and no one could deny it. Elliot Monroe was no longer a shadow lurking in the background. He had become the silent pulse beneath Silver Glen's fractured surface. The root system quietly knitting the community together and pulling it toward his vision. With 17 properties under Redwood Holdings and several more scattered under subsidiaries, Elliot wielded control with surgical precision. Every house acquired wasn't just a home. It was a vote, a voice, a lever. At the next community meeting, Elliot unveiled his first major proposal: the Silver Glen Renewal Project. No longer just about lawns or parking spaces. It was a comprehensive plan to revive the neighborhood's failing infrastructure, foster community engagement, and most importantly, establish a resident-led council that would replace the old HOA with transparent governance. The crowd was mixed, some hopeful, others skeptical. But Elliot wasn't done. He announced incentives for residents willing to sell properties to Redwood Holdings. or its affiliates. Above market price, no questions asked. For those who stayed, he promised improvements. Upgraded streetlights, new playground equipment, and an organic community garden managed by volunteers. As the weeks passed, the tide turned. Several holdouts, including long-time Marlene loyalists, began quietly selling to Redwood, their resistance worn down by offers they couldn't refuse. A few neighbors stayed, cautious but intrigued by the fresh energy Elliot brought. Yet, not all were convinced. Late one evening, Elliot found a flyer, slipped under his door, anonymous and sharp. Beware the roots that bind, for they choke what they claim to nourish. He smiled. The opposition still lurked, desperate. But Elliot's response was calm. He organized a neighborhood festival, the first in years, inviting all residents, no matter their stance. Barbecues, music, games for kids. The community came, alive in a way no HOA mandate ever could inspire. He walked among them, shaking hands, listening to stories, noting concerns. Here was real power, not in rules or fines, but in connection. Behind the scenes, however, Elliot tightened his grip. He had quietly hired a small team of legal experts and consultants to rewrite bylaws, ensuring future governance would require majority votes from homeowners, majority he controlled, through ownership or loyal proxies. He also began the process of acquiring the clubhouse itself, the last bastion of the old regime, intending to turn it into a community center, free of bureaucracy. But power has a way of revealing hidden fractures. At a private dinner with his closest advisors, Elliot confessed his growing unease. "This isn't just about control," he said. "It's about responsibility. The more I own, the more I'm accountable. If I slip, the whole neighborhood falls." One of his advisors nodded. Power's a root that can grow too deep and strangle its host. Elliot's eyes darkened. "Then I'll be the gardener who prunes it carefully." As summer faded, the neighborhood faced a turning point. The old guard staged a protest, dozens gathering outside the clubhouse, demanding transparency, threatening lawsuits, waving signs accusing Elliot of monopoly and coercion. Elliot addressed the crowd from the porch, calm and measured. "I don't own Silver Glen," he said. "You do, and I'm here to help us build a community that lasts. But that requires trust, and trust requires honesty." The crowd murmured. Some softened, others seethed. Later that night, Elliot stood alone in his garden, looking up at the stars filtering through newly planted leaves. The roots were deeper now, stronger, but he knew the storm was coming, and he was ready. The night was unnervingly still. Silver Glen held its breath. Elliot Monroe sat in his study, a single lamp casting a warm glow over stacks of documents, contracts, bylaws, property deeds, and the latest resident petitions. Months of careful groundwork, negotiations, and quiet battles had brought him here, to the edge of victory. But victory, he knew, was never without cost. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His phone buzzed on the desk. A message from an unknown number. "Meet me at the Old Oak midnight. It's time you know the truth." The Old Oak, the tree Marlene had ordered, cut down, the last symbol of the HOA's cold grip, and Elliot's personal loss. Curiosity pulled him to the door. Under the silver moonlight, the neighborhood was quiet, shadows pooling around the trees, gnarled roots. A figure emerged, small, elderly, frail, but eyes sharp as a hawk. "Elliot Monroe," she said, voice steady despite her age. "I'm Agnes White. I used to be the HOA secretary before Marlene's reign." Elliot's heart skipped. Agnes reached into her coat and pulled out a faded photograph. A young Elliot standing beside a man. Elliot recognized immediately his late brother. "I knew your family," she whispered. "I saw what they did to those trees, to your piece. But it's not just about the trees," Agnes said, stepping closer. "There's something you need to understand about Marlene's power. And about your revenge." She handed him a thick, dust-covered binder filled with letters, meeting minutes, and coded correspondence. You see, Marlene's control wasn't just about rules. She was protecting something. Hidden beneath Silver Glen, beneath your precious neighborhood, is a secret that could undo us all. Elliot flipped through the pages, heart pounding, maps marked in red, notes about underground water rights, legal, disputes that predated the HOA itself, agreements buried by developers to protect a vast aquifer beneath the land. Marlene's HOA wasn't just a neighborhood police force. It was a guard protecting the water source from exploitation. Elliot looked up. "So when I bought these homes, gained control," he swallowed hard, "I might have inherited more than just votes." Agnes nodded gravely. "The county's been watching. Developers are circling. If the HOA dissolves without oversight, this land and its water could be sold off in pieces." The weight of responsibility crushed Elliot's chest. His quest for revenge had blinded him to a deeper truth. The trees, the lawns, the homes, they were part of something far larger. He thought about the saplings he had planted, the community gardens, the festivals. Could his vision protect this hidden legacy? Or would it become the very destruction Marlene fought to prevent? Suddenly, lights flickered across the neighborhood. From every yard, windows glowed. Neighbors emerged, drawn by a silent signal. At the old oak, Elliot stood with Agnes as dozens gathered, faces both wary and hopeful. He took a breath. "I didn't know," he said, voice steady but humble. "I thought this was just about property, control and trees. But it's more, much more." He looked at the crowd. "We have a choice. We can keep fighting old battles, or come together to protect what truly matters." A murmur rippled through the group. From the crowd stepped Linda, the single mother and new community chair. "We need a new kind of HOA," she said firmly. "One built on transparency and stewardship, not power and fear." Elliot nodded. Together, as dawn broke over Silver Glen, the final leaf fell from the old oak, drifting gently to the ground, and with it, the past. The community breathed, united, not by control, but by purpose. Elliot smiled quietly. His revenge had ended. A new story was just beginning.